EVs in your city ordinances today? And we have two great presenters to talk to us about it. So as usual in your Zoom name, if a lot of you have already done it, but if you haven't already, just rename yourself to also include the community that you're representing, just as we're asking questions. It kind of helps give context to the rest of us. And also in the chat, it's kind of a bigger question today. Usually we do something a little softer, but we want to hear what is a question that you have related to ordinances that you hope is answered by this webinar. So I would encourage you that takes a little bit of time. It's not a quick, oh, I like vanilla ice cream. So if you need more time to think about it, feel free to pop those questions into the chat throughout the presentations, or as our presenters are talking about things, we will be monitoring the chat the entire time. So as I mentioned, our agenda today is, first up, we have Brian Ross from the Great Plains Institute to talk to us about best practices in EV ordinances, followed up by Noelle Bakken giving us the city perspective of what it's like to walk through this process, followed by a joint Q&A session for both of our presenters. And as always, we have our next steps section before we close up. So without further ado, I will pass it on to my colleague, Brian. Brian, thank you for being here today. We are excited to hear about best practices in EV ordinances.
Okay, unmute. Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to be here, and I almost didn't make it. I had the wrong link, but I got redirected, so now I'm here. I'm going to run through kind of the best practices that we've been developing over some time, both through kind of some research and investigation around the nation, and as well as some great work that Rebecca and her team have done on the EV Smart project as we move forward in terms of developing best practices. And do I just have you guys advance the slides? Is that what we're doing?
Yep. So I will go to the next one.
All right, thanks. So I am an urban planner by profession, and so I had to put in this kind of note about how ordinances work in different communities, and recognizing that while we can develop best practices and we can develop kind of sample language for people, it will integrate into different communities' ordinances in different ways. And so one of the things that you have to do is really decide the kind of content that you want to achieve out of the best practices, because not every this is a portfolio of best practices, not a cut and paste set of ordinance language. So you have to figure out what content that you would like to include, both from the kind of the standpoint of anything that you might see in our presentation, as well as things that you might have heard about in other communities, and then kind of figure out where that's going to go into your code. And it will fit in different places. Different codes are structured in different ways. There are some general principles that are cross zoning ordinances, but still there are some things that are unique. And we have helped enough communities integrate model ordinances and sample language to know that sometimes the language doesn't exactly fit. So anyway, do be prepared for that. We are with help on the EV Smart team kind of through that process. Okay, next slide. I'm going to first talk about four kind of categories of best practice that the EV Smart program has developed and that you need to think about for your land use regulations. And then we're going to talk about some of the principles and the best practices associated with integrating equity into your ordinance as it relates to EVs. So the first of those best practices is really understanding the use element of an ordinance. The kind of fundamental characteristics of any ordinance include things like use, which is the kind of the thing that it is as a land use, the dimensional standards associated with it, things like intensity, and any characteristics or standards around design and siting. So the use standards here are kind of, we emphasize because it's important to recognize that not all EV infrastructure is the same land use. There are different types of characteristics that different kinds of EV charging infrastructure will have, and you need to recognize how that fits differently within your ordinance and kind of and address those differently. And the kind of four things we've identified here, the type of use, which is where and how the charger will be used. As an example, a DC fast charger or level 3 charger, which is going to be something that people are going to come and park at for a relatively short period of time, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, and then leave, and they're kind of going to come for a fast charge, as opposed to a level 1 or a level 2 charger, where they're going to be plugged in all likelihood, or they could be for extended periods of time, and what that means in terms of the land use. The density or intensity of use is another kind of basic zoning element that we talk about, and that's, as an example, a single charger in a parking lot versus a bank of chargers in a parking lot, or a single charger, a single DC fast charger versus a bank of level 2 charger. And those are different kinds of intensity and will have different ramifications in terms of kind of how many people are coming and going from the site, as well as kind of what kind of use it's being used for, and over what time period. The different kinds of EV chargers are restricted. Some of them are, for instance, only available to the employees of a given facility. Sometimes it's only available to customers of a retail institution or a other kind of land use that is installing the charger. There are chargers that are for fleets only. Those are obviously not available to the public. The kind of public access is an important element of figuring out what your use is and how you address that in your ordinance. And then finally, the business case. We do have some places that will distinguish between a charger for which it has an economic use. In other words, it's basically selling access to electricity and charging, and is associated with a given vendor, versus a end use that might be not, where there is no charge or only a minimal charge, such as you might see at a city hall. What is the business case of the end use, and how does that affect your land use considerations as you move forward in your ordinance? So I'll go on to the next one, which is a recommendation for how you address what we would call accessory uses. And the recommendation here in terms of a best practice is that you, in your ordinance, explicitly permit accessory uses. Most ordinances are going to allow for level 1 and level 2 chargers to be installed as an accessory use without necessarily calling them out in the ordinance, but we recommend that it be done explicitly, so there's no doubt that all level 1 and level 2 chargers should be treated as an accessory to the parking facility or the associated land use that has the parking facility where they're located. That these things are not something that requires a conditional use permit or any kind of a special permit. They should be a explicitly permitted accessory use, subject to perhaps design standards, but not requiring a separate zoning permit. DC fast charging, on the other hand, is a case where it could be an accessory use, or it could be treated as a principal use or a conditional use. The level 3 chargers, for instance, can be where they are in a facility that where there is clearly not going to be ramifications to the surrounding transportation network. such as in the warehouse industrial district here, as noted in this sample language, is perhaps an instance where it would be allowed as an accessory use. On the other hand, a couple of DC fast chargers that are located in a gas station or a similar kind of place where they are going to be the use, they're going to be the thing that draws people to that location. You might want to consider treating that differently because it could result in traffic patterns that are changing because of people pulling in and out or waiting for the charger as other people are already charging at it. So we would recommend always to have accessory uses for the level 1 and level 2, and to carefully consider when you can use as a permitted accessory use for the DC fast charging. Okay, next slide. Third thing is parking standards for both design and performance. The best practice recommendations are that in your parking standards, you should require a minimum level of EV charging. This will vary a little bit state by state, since there are a couple of states that it's actually required already, like the state of New Jersey. But for the most part, it's something that you can, in most states, in the parking standards for surface lots, actually require this in your zoning ordinance. The recommendation here is that a minimum level of EV charging be included in your parking standards, but recognize that there are going to be some land use variations, residential, commercial, multifamily, where that level might change a little bit. Another question is about aesthetics. When you have banks of chargers or a DC fast charger with a big transformer, should you be requiring aesthetic or landscaping standards as part of that? We would say that you look first to the rest of the landscaping requirements that you have in your ordinance. Most communities will have, communities will have anywhere from very aggressive landscaping and aesthetic requirements to very few for other kinds of land uses. And wherever your community is on that spectrum, what is the level of comfort that the community has for regulating aesthetics should be where you also land for kind of aesthetic requirements around EV charging infrastructure. And then signage, of course, is another thing. We actually want EV chargers to be used. We want people to know where they are, particularly, well, at least if they're public chargers. And think about how you might want to standardize signage across the community so that people can find the chargers and use them, so we can kind of accelerate this EV transition. Okay, next slide. Just some examples of how you might incorporate EV into parking standards. And in some cases where it is allowed, you can actually use this standard in the building code. There are some limitations on that, and it is evolving. But a single family, generally, we would require that all single family residences have some kind of an EV capacity, EV capable or EV ready. There's 3 different definitions of what a EV ready or EV capable means, or EV installed. And we have seen ordinances that will require, for instance, a certain percentage of the parking lots in a parking stalls in a parking lot to be EV capable, and a certain number to be EV installed, where there's actually in the development process, it does include actually putting in chargers. Capable is just wiring parking slots in order to be installed later. And EV capable is where there is kind of a middle ground between the two, where there may not be an actual charging infrastructure, but there will be an outlet that can be used very easily in order to charge or add a charging equipment. A single family should always have something, typically at the 240 volt level. So an EV capable charger. Multifamily, we have different kinds of parking stall requirements that we've seen in sample ordinances. Generally, the kind of minimum threshold, or 10 to 20% for multifamily parking, should be at least EV capable, and we would recommend that at least a few of them are EV installed. And then for commercial lots, where there will be somewhat of a difference in terms of the standards, we are typically seeing 20% EV installed for commercial parking in new facilities. at least for lots of a certain size. Usually there is an exemption for small parking lots with, less than 10 spots or something like. But these are the kind of the standards we're seeing other communities adopt. A few years ago on the commercial side, we were seeing a standard of closer to 5%. Now we're seeing a standard closer to 20% where people are actually adopting this. Okay, next slide. And the fourth standard on land use regulations is really to recognize that EV charging is not dissimilar to in terms of as a land use to be developed in the way that gas stations are actually developed nowadays. Nobody builds a standalone gas station anymore. They always build a gas station combined with a convenience store, a car wash, an auto repair facility, and a coffee shop. And because those uses create a synergy, in the location that they're at. In a similar way, we would expect that EV charging should be developed in places where there are similar kind of mix of uses. So this is the business model for EV charging, especially when you're talking about level 2 chargers, where people, you want to have level 2 chargers where people are going to be wanting to stay for an hour, 2 hours, or all day in the case of a workplace. DC fast chargers, in contrast, while they should have those same kinds of elements, are probably going to be able to along transportation corridors, and you need to think about circulation patterns, as I kind of mentioned earlier. Okay, next slide. Now I want to run through some of the equity considerations that you might want to think about in your ordinance as it relates to ensuring that we have access, of EV charging infrastructure to people who might not have access to home charging. Most charging will occur at the home. This is a big difference, of course, from a gasoline-powered vehicle where all of your fuel is going to happen at a gas station. In the case of an EV, most of the fueling is going to happen at home, unless you don't have the opportunity to do that. And this is something that should be built explicitly into your ordinances. First of all, there's accessibility issues around access for people who have disabilities. And we have seen pretty standard, most of the ordinances include accessibility guidelines or even a requirement similar to your ADA parking standards of spots that meet ADA standards that are also going to have an EV capacity to them. So when you're retrofitting an existing facility, a lot of times you can just do it, meet this standard by putting in your EV charger next to the existing handicap spots that are in your lot, or obviously if you're doing new development, making sure maybe you have an extra ADA standard that is also an EV charging standard. There are some very helpful design standards that are noted here that people have been working on, and that in terms of things like cord management, the distance that the charger needs to be from the vehicle, whether or not there's a curb kind of in the way in order for people who are getting out of the vehicle to be able to access it, et cetera. Okay, next slide. Another equity consideration is to address those places where people do not have access to home charging, and that is to consider how you might enable charging in your right of ways. The city controls the right of ways. It is a good place to put charging, but there are some considerations for it. This is something that, in particular, in your underserved or disadvantaged neighborhoods, in order to allow some access, is to kind of focus your right-of-way charging in those kinds of places. There's also some consideration in right-of-ways that you can make in commercial districts where people of all households will come to shop or to go to restaurants or whatever, and to provide them charging there as well. So kind of right-of-way charging is definitely an equity consideration that you should consider in the appropriate locations. Okay, next slide. Says affordable multifamily housing kind of considerations. Again, the more you can enable people to charge while they're at their home, the better off we're going to be into the EV market transformation. Enabling people to charge at home will make a huge difference in terms of allowing people to participate in the electrification revolution that we're all trying to bring about. So make sure that in your multifamily housing, you have EV capable, ready, or installed requirements that promote that equitable access. Make sure that in particular, that it's prioritized in your affordable housing units. And there are several recommendations here that we have kind of pulled out that kind of go to that. Okay, next slide. Finally, just kind of being cognizant of where EV chargers are being installed. We have seen circumstances where we kind of let the market work, and guess what happens is EV chargers end up in more affluent areas because that's the people who tend to have EV vehicles. So you need to consciously identify those areas in your community where there is access by low income or other disadvantaged households, so that they have fairly ready access to charging infrastructure. And this can be, kind of targeting in the right of way, targeting in multifamily buildings, et cetera, but doing that neighborhood analysis kind of in the location and data assessment that is kind of noted here. And referencing the good toolkit, USDOT, about kind of that planning element about where you want to put this infrastructure. Okay, next slide. Just some resources that we have developed over the years. Rebecca has done a really great job of updating our database of ordinances. We did the first, I think, back in 2018, where we kind of did a scan across the nation and said, what are cities doing in regard to different kinds of EV ordinances and different kinds of best practices. We developed this database. We have fairly recently kind of updated that, and there is an ongoing effort to kind of keep this database, at least to some extent, up to date. It is not a complete inventory of ordinances, but rather a sampling of ordinances as we're kind of seeing across the nation in different places. And then a nice publication on the EV Smart website, ordinance considerations that has been developed. Over time, we've updated these things several times as new best practices have been developing. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, as we moved in the early days of EV ordinances from a requirement of 2% or 5% up to 25% or 50%, or even in a few cases we've seen requirements for 100% EV capable parking standards, so that in the long run those can be adopted. So that's the end of my presentation. Are we going to move on or do questions here? I think we're going to move on, right?
Yes. Yep. So
Okay.
Up next, thank you, Brian. That was very informational. And if, keep those questions, there's already some popping up in the chat. So keep those questions in mind, and we'll get to them after we hear from Noelle Bakken, this sustainability specialist from the City of Roseville. Noelle, thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited to hear your perspective on this matter.
Fantastic. Thank you for the invitation. And as a heads up, I'm battling COVID right now, so hopefully everything that I say comes out clearly, but my presentation should be relatively short. I just have 3 slides.
Oh my goodness.
So
well, thank you. Thank you for coming and battling through. That's dedication.
It's pretty mild this time around, luckily, so it's not too bad. But yeah, I'll start by going over kind of the basics of what our ordinance is, and then go through the process of how we went through and adopted it, and kind of what we're looking at with implementation in the months ahead. Next slide. So these are the requirements for our particular ordinance. It's not quite as aggressive as some of the requirements that Brian indicated in his presentation, but we require any new developments with 30 or more spots to have at least 5% of required parking spaces with EV chargers for residential uses, and for commercial, non-residential at least 2 parking spaces or more, and one of them has to be accessible. And we do define accessible as if it's immediately adjacent to an ADA accessible parking spot. We consider that meeting that accessibility requirement. It is optional for any lots with 29 or fewer spaces. We're requiring level 2 or higher in non-residential uses, and we are allowing residential uses to drop down to that level 1 level. We consider that acceptable for residential, since a lot of people are going to be just charging overnight. We do not have any requirements laid out for specifically single family residential. We're leaving that up to the homeowners at this point. And we do have an exemption in place too. So if the charging requirements exceeds 5% of the entire project cost, then we give the developer an option to waive that requirement as well. We allow this in all different land uses. And then this is part of our zoning code chapter. So that's the area that it went in Roseville's, in Roseville's code. Next slide. So at the time that we adopted this, we're already working with the consulting firm HKGI on our zoning code updates. So we were working on updating our zoning code to comply with our 2040 comp plan, whatever necessary requirements we needed to make to align it with that. So that was the phase 1 that we worked with HKGI. The second phase was kind of seeing what other things that we could add based on what we thought would maybe advance some of those environmental goals. So that was kind of where this came in for consideration. So we added in the EV charging requirement. We also were looking at some sustainable land use incentives, which unfortunately didn't go through. One city that we looked at particularly when we were adopting this ordinance was St. Louis Park. So this ordinance is very similar to St. Louis Park's ordinance language. So thank you, Annie. We also used the ordinance summary that Brian referenced to at the end of his presentation. That was really useful. Overall, we didn't have a lot of pushback from council or our planning commission throughout the process of this. I think the sustainable land use incentives that we were proposing were a little bit more contentious, and so maybe in consideration of that, the EV charging requirements looked a little bit less heinous. But either way, that passed relatively easily, so that was nice that we didn't have to fight that too much. Next slide. As far as implementation, so like any other zoning code or any other ordinance, we require that developers already have an understanding of what our code requirements are and plan accordingly. We'll confirm that the plan meets our zoning code at the building permit phase. And if it does meet the code, then we'll issue the permit. We've had very few developments so far since this was adopted in March of 2023. So we have one that we're kind of battling right now, where they're kind of saying that they submitted a plan before this code was updated and so on and so forth. And so they might wind up submitting a variance to try to get around it. We have 2 other newer developments that we really haven't seen the plans yet. So that kind of remains to be seen how they respond to that. Generally, our planners are really communicative with the developers so that they are understanding of what our requirements are, especially when there's a new requirement. So as soon as this was put in place, our planners were letting developers that they already were in communication with know that this is a thing that they need to consider. One of the other requirements is that if a parking lot is going to be expanded or redeveloped by more than 25%, that will also trigger this requirement. We might be adjusting that based on kind of how some of the plans come forward in the next few months. We feel like that definition isn't very clear right now. So that's something that we're looking to refine a little bit more. And that is pretty much it for us. It's still pretty new. Like I said, we only have, I think, 3 developments so far in the works that this will apply to. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how that shakes out in the next several months. I think we could probably move on to the Q&A at this point.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Noelle. interesting to hear about, well, number one, that there wasn't too much pushback, which we always love to see. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen here. So as to encourage conversation and discussion, there are some questions already in the chat, and so I'll just vocalize those, but once we get through those, if you have anything that you would like to ask our presenters vocally, feel free to do that. Also, as I mentioned before, we'll keep an eye on the chat if you prefer just to put your question in there. So the first question that we had, and it kind of already was addressed, but someone was wondering, was there much pushback from policymakers or the public in instituting an EV ordinance? So maybe we didn't hear quite as much of that, the public piece. And so Noelle, I'm wondering if you can address that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know when I was chatting with our community development director to talk through this process, since I was kind of just marginally on the outside of this development process when it was put together, we didn't really do a whole lot of public input prior to the actual zoning code update. I know they did some public outreach as far as some of the changes, general changes with our comprehensive plan. But just from other conversations I've had with folks around the community, I know there's a lot of support, especially a lot of residents really want to see these EV charging infrastructure added to multifamily developments, since that's really an issue for people who live in apartments that don't have access to charging. So I think really the biggest pushback we've received is really from developers more than anything else. But our council and our commission were very supportive of this issue.
Great. The next one might be focused a little more towards Brian, but Noelle, also interested to hear your thoughts. St. Louis Park adopted an EV ordinance in 2019. And so Annie's just wondering, since it's been a few years, if they need to make any updates according to new best practices.
I haven't looked at the St. Louis Park ordinance for a while. I did look at it when it first kind of came out, and I actually thought that it was a fairly complete ordinance and did a good job. It was a pretty impressive bit of work that St. Louis Park did. My guess is that unless you wanted to tinker a little bit with the percentages in the parking places. I don't think that there's any kind of really evolving issues that you need to be thinking about. The other issue that has come up in other communities as EV infrastructure has grown is when we start to see more DC fast chargers installed, and in the places that they're going, and how that might have an impact on traffic flow around certain kinds of parking areas. Commercial facilities have to submit a parking plan. It has to meet traffic flow standards, and if you, depending on where you would put, in some instances, DC fast charger, it might affect that. But that would probably be the only thing that I think that would come up for St. Louis Park, kind of at least in terms of a big change that you might want to consider.
Yeah, and when we were putting our ordinance together, as I mentioned, we really relied heavily on St. Louis Parks. We thought it was a great example, and so we used a lot of their language, and we kind of went back and forth on the percentages quite a bit on what we should require, and we felt that 5% was an appropriate range for I think it's for the 30 to 49 parking spots, residential. And as I mentioned in the chat, I know there was a question that we're probably going to get to next, but we have been keeping a close watch on the state building code update as well. And I dug into it quite a bit before this presentation as well, just because our community development department was curious if anything had come out of it. And, right now they've added definitions for EV charging, but they haven't added any actual requirements yet. So that'll probably also, we might make some changes depending on what they require as well, once they define those a little bit more exactly.
Brian, I kind of have a quick follow-up question to this. So if you're just a general city, how often would you suggest, just looking at your ordinance to see if it's up to date or not?
Well, as a planning professional, we like to have communities look at their ordinance every year to kind of evaluate that. But we recognize that that's also a big task. Cities are usually in the spending all their time implementing the ordinance rather than kind of going through and looking at updates. The trigger most communities use for an update is when they start getting a lot of requests for variances, for instance, for a particular provision, and they recognize that it's not, it maybe is not fitting the marketplace in a way that makes some sense. That is not in and of itself a justification for changing your ordinance, but we have, I mean, sometimes people will ask for variances because they just don't want to do it, and obviously you want them to do it. The other trigger in this case, I think, would be important to consider is as your climate goals evolve, because obviously the EV ordinance is both a response to the market and trying to future-proof your community, but also trying to make sure that you're meeting climate goals as you're moving ahead. And I think that's kind of where, to me, looking a little bit further ahead, and I know that some communities are kind of uncomfortable with going with a higher number on the number of required EV chargers or EV capable or ready chargers spots. But you do have to think, when development is occurring, you want this to meet your climate goals that are in 2050 or 2040, whenever you kind of farthest outline is. And if the current infrastructure is insufficient in order to allow for that facility to be consistent with a 2040 climate goal that you have adopted, you need to take a hard look and maybe swallow hard and ask some questions about whether or not you're going to require retrofits later, or try to find incentives to do retrofits later rather than just requiring it now, particularly around EV ready and EV capable. So I that would be my recommendation. The triggers really are responses to market, but also making sure that you're being consistent with the long-term goals. You're building long-term infrastructure. You have to be consistent with long-term goals on your climate work.
Great. So Noelle, you did kind of answer this one. I did just want to add to, there was a question about our requirements to install EV chargers in the new development now legal under the state building code. And as you mentioned, there is a working group that will be meeting to discuss that. And maybe they've already been, now that it's the end of August, they might have already started those meetings. And as far as I'm aware, they are open to the public, and maybe Lindsay, you can put some additional information about that in the chat if people are interested in attending those meetings. But
yeah, and I would just, I mean, that's in progress, and we really hope to see that the whole building code situation be clarified in the near future. In the meantime, the kind of clear area that has been defined, I believe, is in surface parking lots, because those are not addressed in the building code. There is a pretty clear authority that the city has to require whatever they want to require there in regard to parking infrastructure. It is a gray area when you start talking about structured parking and kind of requirements within, for instance, a multifamily building. Those are probably going to be ultimately defined by the building code rather than by zoning ordinances.
Great, thank you for that clarification in addition to that. So the city of Woodbury is wondering, have communities experienced pushback from the development community for requiring specifically EV installed and EV ready?
We have on one specific development. We don't have EV ready requirements. I think we wanted to make our ordinance fairly simple, so we are just requiring EV chargers to be installed. And that's more they are pushing back because they don't want to pay for it, but they also are trying to contest that, they submitted a plan before this was put in place, but they actually they didn't receive their building permit before this was put in place. So it's, I think it's going to be a hard sell for some developers, but I don't know. I don't mind pushing back on the development community because I feel like this is just where everything's going to be going. But I know community development might feel a little differently.
Yeah, and I have heard of some pushback, but there also most developers, particularly market rate developers, are recognizing that they need to build in this because people are asking for it. Yeah, people like me. I'm an apartment dweller. I own EV and a plug-in hybrid, and that's one of the things when I go to a facility, I say, "Where's the EV charging?" So they're hearing it from the marketplace, and they're actually moving forward. Although I think that they are moving forward too slowly, because they will respond only to the kind of perceived demand today, not the perceived demand as we look at it from the city standpoint, which would be in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, one of our upcoming developments is a market rate apartment complex, so it'll be interesting to see how that comes up. We did approve a density bonus for them as well, so maybe they'll be a little bit more inclined to comply.
So our next question is, has anyone received any pushback or concern from their fire departments in terms of chargers in underground or enclosed parking structures?
We have not. And our fire department's actually looking at eventually getting an electric fire truck, so I think they're pretty on board.
Yeah, I think from the standpoint of the infrastructure, you're very unlikely to see pushback from the fire departments because it's an electrical device. There's it's another in most cases going to be another 240 volt circuit, and they deal with electrical devices as long as the devices themselves are meeting all the kind of code and standard requirements. There has been some pushback, or at least I shouldn't say pushback from the fire departments, but there has been some discussion. I have heard really more about the EVs themselves as a fire risk. That's it's always curious because of course there as a percentage of vehicles there are more vehicle fires associated with gasoline cars than with EVs, but there's always those cases where someone says, "Oh, well, the flood down in Mississippi, vehicles were submerged and then they burned for 3 days." And then of course there was also some the Chevy Bolts had a manufacturing difficulty that resulted in bad publicity around that. So it's really been about the vehicle than it is about the charger.
Yeah, we have a Chevy Bolt that was part of that recall. So we've been experiencing that firsthand. And I've also been watching pretty closely. I know New York City, as far as electric bicycles go, they've seen a lot of building fires from kind of poorly manufactured electric bikes and batteries that weren't really under close inspection and that kind of thing. So I think that's another area that cities are going to kind of want to watch out for a little bit, is if that's going to come up in our charging ordinances too.
Yeah, and I will note that Great Plains Institute is actually working, trying to develop some guidance around batteries generally, including things like batteries associated with solar farms, batteries associated inside of homes, batteries in businesses, batteries in bicycles. And it gets very complicated because every one of those batteries has a different chemistry, and people hear lithium and they think they're all the same, and they're not. So the bicycle fires were actually a very specific, unstable form of battery that we would never see inside of a car. But at the same time, the communities have to think about those kinds of worst case scenarios when they're constructing ordinances. So we're trying to develop a little bit of guidance on batteries as a land use. Stay tuned.
It looks like Bridget and Andy, did you have some comments?
Yeah, I can go quick. Good morning. I don't know if my camera's gonna work or not. It's not. But I was just gonna chime in. I know that I've also heard that it's more the EVs that are the fire risk. But I know a few fire departments have kind of just capped how many they would want to put in one spot for right now, just so that they can learn, if you have like 20 in one spot, it's more like, do they want to fight that fire, or would they rather keep it to, 5 to 10 EVs? So that's how we've kind of navigated the discussion with different cities. And I believe Edina's final code ended up saying something around like 24 EV chargers in one spot. So I don't know if that's something helpful, Brian, for the best practices document, should other cities kind of get that question and maybe have concern. I know, in Burnsville, they're watching it, of course, but it doesn't sound like they're too concerned at this point. But I think as it evolves, it'll be something to keep an eye on too, just from that side of things. Don't want to make the lives harder for our firefighters at all.
I believe so.
Yeah, and again, the perception here is sometimes in excess of the actual risk. If you're concerned about having too many EVs together, well, maybe you should be concerned about having too many gasoline vehicles together. A more volatile fuel than a battery. But of course, we've kind of adapted to that in our over the last 100 years. We've kind of learned to accept a certain amount of risk associated with gasoline fires. And I will also acknowledge that a battery fire and gasoline fires are two different things. And you fight, as firefighters, you have to fight them differently and take different consideration. So I don't want to be completely dismissive of concerns by fire, but I do wonder about to what extent are kind of standards like that actually based in science and risk assessment versus just perception of risk. And I don't have an answer to that. I don't know the studies.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, in St. Louis Park, our fire chief is, my feeling is it's mostly in that perception. But I wanted to bring it up because there's kind of been a collapsing of association with our ordinance requiring these in multifamily underground buildings, and then concern about the battery fires in the vehicles themselves. And it's all just kind of been swirling around with a lot of concern from our fire department. And so I guess I brought it up to see if anyone was dealing with it. It doesn't sound like it so far, but I guess just a word of warning to be prepared that maybe some of that might be coming. But it sounds like there will be some great guidance and other things we can kind of continue to walk through with our fire staff.
Well, and forgive me if I'm out of place, Annie, but maybe if you are listening on this call and you are experiencing something and you want to chat about it with Annie, maybe reach out. You can collaborate on what to present and how to overcome some of that perceived and real concerns that fire departments may have. So it seems like we have two more questions in the chat that I want to cover. The first one is, are retrofit EVSE standards also incorporated in the EV ordinance, or are the standards only applicable to new permit submittals?
So I can answer that first. So our ordinance calls for either any new developments or any significant redevelopment of a parking structure or parking service lot, which we're right now defining as 25% improvement. So like kind of beyond a basic mill and overlay. But again, it's something that we kind of are going to be revisiting as we go, because we haven't had any examples of that yet. And it just fell off my desk. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, generally zoning is a reactive standard. It is not a, reactive to a development proposal. It rarely, in fact, I can't say that I would recommend ever trying to use a zoning standard to address a retrofit, unless it reaches, as kind of Noelle noted, it reaches a certain threshold. We don't want to start requiring people to just go in and retrofit their parking standards with EVs, because that is a fairly significant expense. And it should only happen probably in terms of the zoning requirement at a point of where there's already construction occurring.
Great. Our last question that's in the chat is any experience with incentivizing EVSE parking spaces instead of requiring them? The city of Faribault is looking at reducing required spaces as a bonus for installing EVSE parking spaces.
I know we did consider that with because as I mentioned, we were considering some sustainable land use incentives as part of our phase 2 update. But that was just something that our city council didn't really go for. So we were trying to say, if you put in heat pumps or electrify your heating or put on solar panels or a green roof or this and that, then you could get setback bonuses or height bonuses, things like that. But they didn't really have the appetite for that at this point. So I think it might be, your mileage might vary in your city. But we decided to just go for an outright requirement.
Yeah, and there's I think there's two ways to look at the incentive argument. I mean, one is, as Faribault is already looking at it, is to say, can we provide them with a development incentive at the time of time of approval, to see how they would react. This is actually something that we have suggested in the past as a kind of a slower step by communities that maybe weren't comfortable with a requirement. How effective it is, I don't really know. I have on multiple other issues worked with incentives rather than requirements, and what I generally find is that the incentives are not very effective at actually changing behavior, because there are two things that it work in the changing of behavior. One is, of course, the cost. And is the savings they're getting sufficient in their mind to offset the cost? But the other one is just habit. Developers have a business model. They have a template they work from, and to get them off of that takes usually a very big incentive. And so I would be fascinated to know if by reducing the number of spaces, which is actually a pretty big incentive, whether that would actually elicit change by the developer. That'd be a good thing. The other kind of incentive issue is, and this has been, in fact, some of the communities on the call here have already kind of taken this perspective where you tie the EV requirement to an incentive rather than putting it in your zoning code. Where, for instance, if you're going to get TIF dollars from the city for a development, you will meet a higher standard in terms of EV requirement. I mean, that's another kind of incentive that you should, that I think people should consider quite seriously, especially if they're not quite ready to bite the bullet on making requirements in their code.
Great. Well, we are coming up to the end of our time here today. I want to thank everyone for such great questions. I will note that, Noelle, you just put in the chat a guide that you were looking at when considering incentives, and you also put a link in the chat for the link to your ordinance. And so we will be sending those links out, and the recording and the slides today in our follow-up email. As always, we also will be posting all of these materials on to our EV Smart website under the planning category, or excuse me, the regulation category. And our next webinar will be on Wednesday, September 27th, same time as always. And we will be discussing EVSE permitting, and we have a checklist that will be available to you all to post and to use to create a permitting checklist, which is a requirement in our EV Smart program if you want to earn bronze. And so we really encourage everyone to come to that. And I do also want to offer, if you're having, if you're walking through this ordinance process and if you have any questions or would like someone to review what you've developed so far, please do not hesitate to reach out to any one of us at GPI on the EV Smart team. So happy to help you think through this process in any way. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, and thank you to our, I forgot. Thank you to our wonderful presenters, Brian and Noelle, for coming today. You really, I think, provided so much, a wealth of information for our participating cities. So thank you for that.